Well, I am Howard Scott Warshaw. Thank you. And I am here to do a post-mortem on Yars Revenge, because some of my games actually do die, apparently. So, very quick thing though, I'm just curious. How many of you have heard of the movie Atari Game Over? How many of you have seen the movie Atari Game Over? Okay. How many of you have ever said in your do E.T. is the worst video game of all time? Or agreed with that statement? Now, how many of you have actually played E.T.? Okay, just checking. Okay, well, we're going to talk about Yars, and we're going to get to E.T. How many of you have questions about stuff that you have some questions in mind? Well, you may later. Oh my God. This is going to be a fun talk. Okay, so let's do it. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge was my first game. And there was the box and there was the screen. I saw this graphic on the web, and I thought, it's so funny the way they name stuff. And because these names have nothing to do with what's actually, what the creation of the game was. But it's cute, you know, they put the stuff out there. But it was my first game, it was my first time at Atari. It was tough enough to get into Atari. I literally begged my way into Atari, because the people at Atari weren't sure I would be a good fit for Atari, which is a whole nother story. So, but it was my first game. My first game was very important to me, because firsts are very important to me. And I really wanted to do something spectacular. So I decided, what is Yars going to be about? What am I going to do with it? Yars is about excitement. It's a very dynamic, active, audio-visual, pulsing and throbbing game. And it has what I call a filmic master stroke. How many people know what I mean by master stroke? Really, yeah, I'd be surprised if a lot of things came up, because I made that up. But the master stroke is what I say is like, particularly for one-screeners, there's a style of play that you have to execute to win the game. There's usually a mode you have to get into. There's a flow that you have to get into to really start doing well in the game. And whatever that action is, whatever that action looks like, it's the master stroke. Right? So in Space Invaders, it's popping back and forth. You know, in Asteroids, it's spinning and shooting. So in Yars Revenge, I was thinking about this from the beginning, is what do I want to be, how do I want the screen to be organized when you really win? And the best thing you can do in the game is you destroy the monster and you get the full screen explosion. And when you do that, in order to do that, you have to be moving either up or down, because you're positioning the Zorlon cannon with your vertical position. And then the monster's coming in from the side, and the cannon's coming in from the other side, and you're moving up, and there's a drone that's following you. So you have stuff up and down and right and left. And that's very filmic, because I'm a big film buff. Because before there were video games, there were movies. And I was so into movies. So I wanted to do something that was very filmic. There were a lot of ideas I just stole from movie making that I put into Yars to try and increase the impression of the game, because really, all you're trying to do with a game, or all I was trying to do with a game, is make an impression. Right? Because and I just want the game to have the biggest impression, because the bigger the impression the game makes, the greater the gaming experience is, and hopefully the greater the enjoyment of the player. So everything moves, everything is throbbing, everything's going on, nothing just sits still in Yars Revenge. So that's good for playing. It's horrible for screenshots, though, because anytime you take a screenshot of Yars, something's only half done or half there, or you're not getting the dynamic element to it. So it's just kind of a funny thing that I realized, is the game looks like crap in still shots. And so Yars is about first. Like I said, it's my first game, and I wanted to do everything I could think of that nobody could think of to do and hadn't been done. So Yars is about first. It's the first full-screen explosion in a video game. I've had a very elaborate death sequence, because I think you shouldn't just get paid off when you win. You can get paid off when you die, too. There's no frame. Most 2,600 games have a frame around them, because that reduces the area you have to program in. It reduces the amount of playfield, the background you have to deal with. There's a lot of good reasons to do that. Gives you a place to put the score. Okay, so that's all nice. But what it does is it limits the space the game is in. You know, you think the space you have to play the game is limited to the screen, but that's not true. The space you have to play the game is in your mind, right? So what I did was I eliminated the frame and made a black background because the way I like to watch movies and the way I like to play games ultimately is in the dark at night. And so if you have a black background and the lights are turned off and everything like that, it's bigger. There's nothing is keeping that screen from bleeding out into the rest of the darkness, and it makes the game feel bigger. At least that was my idea. Pause mode. Yars Revenge was the first game to have a pause mode in it, so you could actually stop and go to the bathroom and not lose your high score if you're having a really good game and you're not competing with your own bladder, which I think is not the kind of game we're looking for. Reset from the joystick. If I got myself in a really odd, contorted, but comfortable position, this is exactly how I like playing the game, why should I have to move to keep playing the game? I want people to keep playing and playing and playing and playing my game. I want that experience to go on forever. So I'm not going to do anything to impede them. So I thought it was important to be able to just keep playing and keep going. And the sound-enhanced play experience. Every game has sounds, but I tried to use sounds, layers of sound, to cue events in the game. Again, it was also that's another film thing that I borrowed, really stole. So, because like, in a film, it's very expensive to rent an ocean liner, you know, for a shot in a movie. That's a lot of money. But if I show you two people standing in nice lighting with a fan off the side blowing in their hair, and I play the sound of a ship's horn and some seagulls, and magically, you know, you're on a dock and you can see the ocean liner even though it's not there. So I tried to use that concept to create a bigger game impression, again, by having sounds that cue events, that build tension, that release. And the sound throbs a lot also. I'm big on throbbing, I guess. So there's also metaverse. There's metagaming that goes on, because in Yars there were things that were about the game itself. There's also a lot of things that I was thinking of that were really about the metagame. And by metagaming, you know, most people know what metagaming is, I think, these days. Metagaming is the kind of stuff you do around a game. That's not about the objective of winning the game, but it's talking with friends about game, making your own mini-games. Nowadays, there's lots of stuff available so you can play a game and engage the game the way you'd like. But back then, there was no concept of that. There was just the game. So I tried to make more about the game. And some of the metagaming that went on was there was an Easter egg. So that wasn't new. Warren Robinette, who also is speaking here, he's the guy who did one of the first Easter eggs. But he made it a secret. Because, you know, where Easter eggs came from, the concept of an Easter egg was to put your name in the game. It wasn't because you wanted to have some fabulous, fantastic thing for people to find. That was nice. But the real point of an Easter egg, of having your name in the game somewhere, was to sign it, so if anyone ever challenged your authorship, you had a way of proving you were the author of that game by being able to find this secret thing and display your name, and who else would have put your name in the game if you hadn't made the game? That's really where Easter eggs came from. What I did was make them something that marketing approved and got behind and promoted and made it a part of the thing. And the Easter egg that I chose, HSWWSH, was a key to the meaning of a lot of the story of the naming of the game, which we'll get to later. Oh, but that's a great story. So, also, it was the first game where the code for the game appears on the screen. I don't know how many of you know this already, but you know, the strip in the center, the ion zone is what it's called. That's actually the code in the cart. Very thinly masked and counter-scrolling, 2 streams counter-scrolling, because that was cheap graphics, right? The cheapest graphics in the cart is ROM, just grabbing stuff and throwing it in a register. So it worked. And it was colorful, and it was goofy, and it was fun to look at, so I liked it. It was the first game that had the programmer's name on the product. And that was something that people had been seeking for a while, but this one worked out to have it, because there was an elaborate backstory and comic book. And we'll get to that story also later. And it was also the most tested game in Atari history. It was tested and tested. The game didn't change that much as a result of the testing, but the testing just went on, and that's another story. It was very interesting. So I'm going to tell you about what I'm going to tell you, but I guess I've already done that. So Yars almost became a coin-op game. There was something, right? Because Dave Toyer, the guy who in Coin-Op, who did Missile Command and Tempest and several other games, he really liked Yars. When we were starting to get late in the development and I was starting to see that people were really digging this game, one of those people was Dave Toyer, and I thought, holy crap, and he started to talk to me about maybe doing a Coin-Op version of it. And you know, we always had to do 2600 versions of Coin-Ops. Having a Coin-Op version of a 2600 game would have been revolutionary, and it was under serious consideration. It was also very ironic because Yars was originally assigned as a Coin-Op conversion, which is Star Castle, which is another story I'm going to tell you later. So it's kind of funny that a thing that was supposed to be a Coin-Op conversion became an original game that almost became a Coin-Op, but the big payoff was, didn't happen. So that's a great story. So it was assigned originally as Star Castle. Star Castle was a Coin-Op game at the time, and you know, I wasn't an expert at programming the 2600, but I'd read the manual, and the manual wasn't that long, because it wasn't that complicated a machine. It was a great machine because it had also the elements of what's a great game. The elements of a great game is something that has few rules and a tremendous game space. Right? Having few rules and a limited game space is usually an elemental of kids' games that's something that's boring. Having a huge amount of rules and creating a huge game space is something like football. Okay? Where it can be a compelling game, it can be interesting, but there's a lot of rules, and it takes a long time to learn. But a really great game, really great games have few rules and a huge game space, like chess. Chess is a great example of something that has a very limited rule space, but a huge game space. Backgammon would be another example. So, Star Castle, I just looked it over, I thought, this is really going to suck. And I was really psyched to do my first game, and I was not interested in doing a game I thought would suck. So I actually went to my manager and said, you know, this is going to suck. I just think that this game is going to suck if we try to do this on 2600. I said, but, because I'm a firm believer in the rule that you don't complain without offering a solution. And I said, you know, I can topologically reorganize some of the points of this game and turn it into something else that really would be better adapted for the 2600, and I'd like to give that a shot. And to his credit, he said, sure, go for it. Because this was before marketing took over a lot of stuff. You know, the marketing inversion, the growth of any company, it starts off with technical innovation, and at some point there's the marketing inversion, where suddenly marketing people are driving the company instead of the technical people, and things change. So, hadn't got there yet, fortunately. So I got this, and Time Freeze was born, because Time Freeze was the first working title of this game. Because from the very beginning, one important concept that I had was I want to have a full screen explosion. I want to have a huge payoff when you win. Whatever you do, whatever the max thing is you can do, when you beat the boss in Yars Revenge, you get a payoff. And what I had originally pictured was this thing where they go and the whole screen shifts in color, and then it shows into it. I had a really elaborate thing. It was like working on your victory dance, you know, before you've gotten the touchdown. It was sort of that kind of thing. That was the way I went into Yars Revenge. So no wonder I use football as a metaphor. So here's another thing, is that Yars sucked until it happened. Yars did suck. So I didn't want to do the Coin-Op because I thought that would suck, and then I started making this game, which looked kind of cool, but it kind of sucked. And it was very uncomfortable to me to think, geez, I got away from having to do the thing that would suck so I could make something that sucked. I was getting my head around that, and that wasn't good. But I was overcommitted to a bad control scheme, because sometimes when we're making a game, there's some things we're flexible about, and there's some things, damn it, that's how it has to be. And the controller scheme for Yars was one of these things, like in Star Castle, it was a right, left, rotate, and a thrust button. And that was your motion control. It's an asteroid-style motion control, which is fine. That can work. But you don't have all those buttons on a joystick. So when you start trading it off, and I was using that, it really kind of locked the controller down. And what I did was to create the Zorlon cannon so you can make the big kill shot in the game, you just pull back on the joystick. So it was very easy to access the Zorlon cannon. You just keep shooting. But it was hard to move around. Because for me, the right-left thrust is not a great way to go. I like move and go. You know, I like you push it where you want to go, and it goes. More of a mouse-style control. So I kept running this by people, you know, can't you play it like this? And there was one guy, Owen Rubin, who was a really very cool guy. He worked in coin-op, and he was the only person who could really play Yars Revenge originally. And he thought this was kind of cool, but he was good at doing the right-left thrust thing. And I thought, most people aren't. And I couldn't get my head around letting it go because I needed that backstick to create the Zorlon cannon. There was a basic game mechanic that I would lose if I went to that other controller scheme. But at some point, I had to accept the fact that it did suck, and that it wasn't really much fun to play. So I said, okay, forget it, I'm going to shift the controller scheme, and now I'm going to have to do something else. There's got to be another way. And then that's when it happened. And what it was I needed a new way to activate the cannon, and so I switched it from a button on the controller to a game mechanic. And that was like a light bulb going off in my head. Because what I realized, what I learned in that moment, was that if you make objectives, make sub-objectives in the gameplay as part of the game mechanic instead of controller buttons, you give the player more to do, it increases the drama of the game, it increases the complexity of the game in a very simple way. So then I linked the creation of the cannon to touching the screen, touching the shield, eating the shield, or touching the monster if the shield's gone. And now it was kind of cool, because now you have to put yourself in jeopardy to get access to the weapon, and that was good. And I realized this was a really interesting dynamic in games. Just like when the Kotile, the monster, the big shot in Yars is to hit the monster when it's in flight, because the monster turns into a swirl, and away it goes, and then it can track you, and that's the most dangerous element in the game. And if you kill it then, you get the biggest payoff, you get the most points, it's all good. But what's interesting is you have the monster that's when it's most powerful, it's most vulnerable for attack. And by the same token, for you to get the power to attack the monster, you have to risk vulnerability. And the idea of constantly playing with that vulnerability and not allowing you to just lay back and stay safe actually made the game start to really work. And suddenly, when I changed that controller scheme and added that mechanic, and there were some tweaks here and there that went on, but that was a watershed moment in the development of Yars. And suddenly, the game was very compelling. And people were getting it and digging it and playing it. And people liked the look of the game. So that was cool. So this was a game that everybody liked. Pretty much everybody liked. And people were digging it, we were playing it, we were excited about it, people thought it looked good, this was right around the time when we finally got a graphic artist. Marilyn Toyer, who was the first graphic artist in the history of video games, came to Atari during the development of Yars Revenge, and her first assignment was to go and review the graphics on all the current games in development and see what needed going, and she just passed on. She said, this is fine, I don't want to do anything. Everybody was cool with this game, so it's like, let's release it. Let's release it, because this is my first game. And back then, you really bought into your game. There's stuff about egoless programming. How many people have heard the term egoless programming? Really? Am I that old? Holy crap. Okay. There used to be a thing called egoless programming. People were saying you should not be over-involved in your code or your product and stuff. And the idea is to be able to accept criticism and stuff, which is always a good idea. But the idea that you don't really care how your game is doing or that you're not totally involved, people who were not that involved or were separated from their game were not usually the people who made good games. I mean, anybody can make a bad game. I think I've proved that. But, it's, to make a good game, it takes a lot of commitment, and you want that to go. And what that means, when a game goes, what that means is that you get to go into a store and see your product, and it's your product because nobody else worked on this. It was a total work of authorship. And you see your product on the wall, and there it is. And then, if it's one of the better games, you see people playing it because it's on one of the demo machines. And you get to see people playing your game and having that experience, and it's like, I get goosebumps right now just talking about it. That is a super exciting moment. And I wanted that. I had heard people talk about that. I knew I was in line for it. I was getting close to it. By August of '81, I was ready. I was ready to go. The game was ready to go. It was all set. And it's like, let's go. But no, there was there were issues with the playability. So they put it in tests, and they put it in another test, and they had the peer review stuff. And it went through focus test and focus test. And seriously, you know, like, what's going on? And every time it was doing very well in the test. It came back from the test, it was great. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And then there seems to be another issue. So somebody had some issue with the game. And that was weird. That was just a very political thing, because politics happens too. But they called for a play test. So focus tests, you know, most of you know what a focus test is, right? You get like a relatively small number of people to come into a room and play your game and discuss it and talk about it, and it's very living roomy, and it's all good. A play test is where you bring 100 or more people in, you give them 2 games to play, and they rate the 2 games. And it's a very cold numbers, hard thing, okay? So we're gonna do a play test. Whatever. So the play test gets scheduled. It's scheduled for Seattle, which I don't really know why. And the big question in a play test is, who are you gonna test against? What game are you gonna test against? So when I found out that the game Yars was going to test against was Missile Command, which was Rob Fulop, a very good friend of mine, is the one who did that. And that was the #1 game. And it was a great game. And it was a very true representation of the coin-op. And I'm like, holy crap, are you kidding? You know, so the bar was set. I'm not feeling good. So I flew to Seattle to watch the test and to track the numbers as it came in. And like the first sheet I looked at, of course, was very low for Yars. And I thought, oh, man, no. But then it started to get better, and it started to get better, and it went for 2 days. I sat in a dark room looking through a 2-way mirror, watching people play this and fill out their sheets. And by the end of the test, Yars Revenge set the record in play tests. And I'm like, can we release it now? You know, can the game go? And so they did, and they took somebody else and changed their position. So there was some kind of weird battle going on, but they finally did release it. And what was interesting was, you know, there's 4 basic demographics, right? There's young women and young men, and adult women and adult men. And the group, it tested pretty high in all the groups, but the group it tested the highest in was adult women. And Atari had been screaming for games that appeal to adult women. They said, we've got to find a way to get that market going and get it in there. And I'm like, well, here you go. Here's a game. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's a space action shooter, which is exactly the game that adult women don't want to play, because the people in marketing who never played games knew all about who wanted to play games back then. So it was very interesting, and they literally had conversations with some of the female engineers about, can't we do like a shopping game? Can't we do something like that? And it's like, really? Carla Meninsky was great. She did Star Raiders, another great game. Right? And they're trying to tell her to do like a shopping game. And it was insane. But here was a game that the testing proved appealed to adult women, so they marketed it to like 10-year-old kids. And it was like, it was a weird company to work with. It was a very strange place to be, but that's what made it an amazing place. But the problem with Atari is you can never expect it to make sense. Working at Atari was an amazing place as long as you were willing to release the idea of things making sense. Because when you expected things to make sense, you were losing touch with Atari. So that's what happened with the testing. And so after that, they finally decided to release Yars. So Yars did go out. And I got the feeling. I got to see it happening in stores. That was an amazing, amazing experience that I recommend you all go back in time and try sometime. So, because nowadays it's hard to do a work that's pure single authorship, right? It's too big. So now console games are huge, and I've worked on big console games too, none of note. And it's a very different business. But now there's the resurgence of single screen gaming and mobile gaming and small platform gaming. So, you know, once again, games have risen to their true place of, you know, if I've got a little bit of time to waste, I know exactly how to waste it now. And that's, which to me is part of what games are all about. So here's another thing about Yars. Yars was done in 4K. I had 4K bytes of ROM, 128 bytes of RAM. That's what the 2600 was about. So as a comparison, Robotron, I heard Eugene Jarvis give a talk, and he talked about on Robotron, He had 128 bytes of RAM, and he had 2K of ROM just for his sound. And I thought, wow, different scale. It was amazing that we were trying to replicate with the 2600 these coin-op games that were going so far ahead of the technology, so you couldn't. But the thing is, working in something that limited, that constricted, that was the fun. I mean, it takes an economist to do something like that, someone who specializes in the field of allocating resources efficiently and finding new ways to go. And you've got to make the most of what you've got. And I just want to put in a little side note that Eugene Jarvis rules. That dude is probably the single best game designer I think there has ever been. Just wanted to say that. So fortunately, Yars was done by an economist. I had a degree in economics before I went to graduate school in computer engineering. So, and I really think that in all my computer endeavors, my background in economics served me much more than my background in technology, because it really taught me about how to find inexpensive or just bold-faced, cheap ways of doing things. So I would take graphics and I would just throw them into the sound and color registers, because it's already there. I don't have to waste cycles loading it. It's all good. So I did things like that, cleaning up the code to make room for the next tweaks, finding ways just to coax a few more bytes out. Nowadays, most data structures are larger than the entire 2600 game. It's an interesting phenomenon. If you think about it, this game was done in 4K. Typical games now are probably in the 4 gig range. It's not unusual to see a game that's 4 gig on disk for what you're going to do. That means that games are literally 1,000,000 times bigger than what they were. That's kind of interesting. Are they 1,000,000 times more fun? They're supposed to be. So we used to do stuff like reprogram the stack register. Okay, there'd be a register that points, and this is where the stack is, and you could actually point that register at graphics elements on the thing instead of pointing it into memory to operate a stack. That was a fun thing to do. And these were just ways of saving cycles, because you're actually driving the electron gun as you go across the screen on the 2600. It was like that ridiculous. And score, you know, we don't need a stinking score display. That's another thing that Yars did, was I didn't have the score on the screen. Because who cares what the score is? You're supposed to be playing. And if you have a truly immersive play experience, you're not paying attention to the score. You're paying attention to what you're doing in the game, and the score becomes a distraction at that point. So I saved the score for the pause screen, and it also meant that I didn't have to do different kinds of kernels, and it made the programming simple. So a lot of the things that I did that seemed like innovative ideas or like interesting ways to go were really just about me being lazy and not wanting to do more involved stuff. And then you sell it as a new idea, because Yars was a lot about marketing, which comes up to one of the great stories about Yars Revenge, in my opinion, and that is how the game was named. How many of you have heard the story of how Yars Revenge got its name? A lot of you know what the name means, right? That Yar is Ray backwards, right, for Ray Kazar. But the way this came about was that marketing, when the game was getting close to release, marketing would come up with suggested names, because that's what marketing did. They put the name on the game, and then you made a commercial. And that was about it. So, and you know, they had games like Rock Fight and Car Drive, and you know, there was all these two-word odd things. But this was my first game, and I wanted it to be spectacular. I wanted to be involved in everything. So what I did was I called the product manager, and I said, hey, has the name been set yet for this game? And he goes, no. I said, can I make a submission? And he goes, sure. And I said, okay. I said, come by tomorrow, I'll have something for you. And what I did was I started to think of, I want to make up a name, and I want it to be a cool name, and what's it going to be? Have you ever tried to make up a new word? You ever tried to actually make up a new word? It's hard. It's hard, because anything you come up with that's really new sounds stupid. It always sounds stupid. And I couldn't think of something. I'm thinking, this is my chance, because one of my dreams has always been to add a word to the English language. For some reason, all my life, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to actually add a word to the language? I thought this was my chance. You know, if I name this character and it becomes very popular, this will become a known entity, a name that's available. So at first, I started thinking, okay, I just tried to make up a free word. And then I thought, now, my usual thinking is I like secret messages. I like hidden ideas and little, you know, secret things and cryptography and all that. And so I just decided, no, let me think of something that's going to relate, something that has meaning. And then I thought, okay, so Ray Kazar is the head of the company. Ray spelled backwards is Yar. That's a viable word. And Kazar backwards is Razak. So I thought, okay, so there's Yar and Razak, so what am I going to do with that? And I thought, you know what? What's really compelling is to have a story. Because a story always makes something more involved, more compelling. So I sat down that night, I started in the evening, and I stayed there all night and I wrote this like 7 or 8 page story called The Yars Revenge of Razak 4. And it was this whole story about how flies get on the first interstellar ships and they mutate over time, then they kill all the humans, they inhabit this solar system, and now there's some other monster that's invading their solar system and taking over. And it was just a little sci-fi story. And I thought, but a story, you know, it's like you can get more money with a gun and a briefcase than you can with just a briefcase. I thought that, you know, with a title and a story, it's going to be better. So the next day I see the product manager and he comes by and I give him the typed up story and the name and all that stuff. I go, here you go, here's the submission. He goes, great, I'll take it over. So the next day he comes by and now is when I'm going to plant the hook. And so he comes by and I go, hey, have they made a selection yet? He goes, nope, but it's, you know, it's all under consideration. I said, hey, would you like to know a secret? And he goes, sure. I said, but you can't tell anybody because I don't want this to unfairly influence the name of the game. And he's like, well, yeah, okay, sure, you know, I'm not going to say anything. So I swore him to secrecy 3 times. Then I said, okay, you know that the Yars thing? And he goes, yeah. I said, what's that backwards? He goes, Ray. And I said, yeah, and Razak, you know that, what's that? And he's, Kazar. He goes, Ray Kazar? Ray Kazar? Ray knows about this? And I said, yeah, of course. I said, I'm not going to do something like this without Ray being involved in it. But I said, but that's why you can't tell anybody, because I don't want this to unfairly influence the name of the game. And he goes, okay, and I swore him to secrecy one more time before he left, and he went. So at that point, I know 3 things, right? I know that Ray Kazar knows nothing about this. I know that he is going to run back and tell everyone. Now that I've sworn him to secrecy, he's going to tell everyone this about Ray Kazar. And I also knew that nobody in marketing had the balls to actually say anything to Ray about it. So I figured I was good. And then the next day he comes back and he goes, guess what? What? They're going with Yars. We're going with Yars. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. That's so great. You know, so I really felt like I got to do a little marketing on it. And then, because it's all about trusting people, right? You know, you have to know who to trust. And I trusted that he, when sworn to secrecy, would totally blab. And I think it worked. And it was funny that months later, we were doing a press demo, and Ray Kazar was there, and I was playing Yars. I was demoing Yars for the press. And Ray comes up to me, he goes, I heard about that thing you did with the name. And I go, yeah, well, what'd you think about that, Ray? He goes, you should probably just make more games, Howard. You know, he was an interesting guy, Ray Kazar. And the egg is the key. The Easter egg, the HSWWSH, the reason I put that in that way is because that's the key to tell you that Yar is Ray spelled backwards, so it's sort of like a little thing. It's a little thing, but it was something I thought was fun. So that there's actually a key. When you find the Easter egg in the game, it gives you the key to tell you that there's more stuff to think about the naming of the terms of the game. Yars has a sequel. You know, after Yars, I wanted to do a Yars 2 because there's this gameplay that kind of came to me I thought would be really fun to do. But then I had to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I did that because that was cool. And I got to meet Spielberg and go through all that stuff. And that was a really fun thing to do. And that was a long, long project because Raiders was a huge undertaking. And when I finished Raiders, I thought, okay, now I'll do the Yars sequel. And then E.T. happened. And I decided to do E.T. Of course, E.T. didn't take that long. And then, but then ultimately I decided I didn't really want to do a game with paddle controllers because this other gameplay that I was thinking of was definitely a paddle controller thing. But I still have that gameplay in my head and I've never seen anybody do it yet, so I may yet do it. It's a simple one-screen thing that I think would be fun. But there was that sequel that never really happened. So Yars was done by that E.T. guy. Okay, so how many, you know, I love this conversation, which happens all the time. He did E.T. in 5 weeks? Oh, E.T. sucks. It's the worst game in history. Have you ever played it? Nah. But I hear he's a psychotherapist now. Well, that's true. Huh. Maybe he's trying to heal the damage that he created. So, and I think there's some truth to that. Yars is in Once Upon Atari. How many of you have heard of Once Upon Atari? There's a little shameless self-promotion here. Once Upon Atari is a documentary series that I did that was done entirely by, of, and with people who actually made games at Atari. And so if you really want to know what it was like working at Atari, the ups and the downs and the tension, because Atari was a place where one day you'd be having an amazing time and you're on top of the world because your game's going to go out and you're going to have the amazing experience. And the next day it looks like nobody's going to have jobs tomorrow because somebody's pissed off and anything can happen. It was a very weird place to work. And so this is just a DVD thing that goes over all that stuff. So I just wanted to put that out there. It's also available for digital download at GOG.com. Yars has therapeutic value. So I want to talk for a second about the idea that I am now a therapist. I am an actual psychotherapist. I have done many things. I mean, after gaming, I went into robotics and various ways of technology. I also became a video producer to do that documentary. And I was a real estate broker for a while. I've been a photographer. I've written several books. I'm a very busy guy. But ultimately, where I came to be was becoming a therapist, which was something I kind of always wanted to do. And you can always follow me on Twitter. I had to put that out there because my wife said, "What? You're going to be talking to all these people? You're not going to tell them your Twitter address?" And I said, "Okay," so I added this slide. So, but it's an interesting thing that people ask me a lot is, where do you come, how does this happen? You go from being in technology to being a therapist. And I think it's a valid question. But what I realize is, well, it's a couple of things. One is, you know, being a therapist or being a game programmer, it's all systems engineering, right? It's just I've moved to a more complex machine, is the way I look at it. But people have trouble grasping that a technology person should be working with people. And you all probably know some people who probably should not be near other people. Because, you know, we all know people like that. But it was something I always wanted to do because it was like, this was one of my things. I have a lot of different areas and avenues that I like to pursue. And at Atari, you had a collection of people who were like that. You had people who were resolving the difference between technology and creativity. Most people at Atari, most of the programmers at Atari, weren't just programmers. They were programmers, they were very skilled programmers, but they all had something else very significant in their life, something that was more creative, something that was more crafty, you know, woodworking, painting, musicians. There was all kinds of artists who were there who also programmed. And resolving that difference of the creative and the technical was a really huge challenge. It was a very interesting thing. And because programming, like I don't do a lot of programming anymore, because it's just, programming has lost its considerable powers to charm me. I mean, it used to be a lot of fun. When I first got into programming, I thought, this is great. This is the end of any other thing I'm going to study, because now I get to play games all the time and not have homework. I just get to go and solve puzzles. And I thought this was amazing to me. I love this. But in time, I realized that programming wasn't solving the creative thing for me anymore. I worked at HP. After college, I went to Hewlett-Packard. And I tried, when I went to Atari, I went there out of desperation. I wasn't desperate to get into Atari. I was desperate to get out of an uncreative programming environment. Because to meet a spec, to have a spec to meet a program, and you have a spec for a program and you write a program to meet the spec, that's not that tough to do, right? If you're a reasonable programmer, delivering a spec is not a hard thing to do. However, if part of that spec is people have to enjoy it, not that when you hit switch A, light B goes on, not a purely objective criteria, but when you introduce a subjective criteria as part of what your specification is, then it becomes a whole different problem. Because there were, you know, I wouldn't say there was an incredible amount of people who could program the 2600. The 2600 was a real mess. And it's a good thing that we don't try to program machines like that anymore, because it was just absurd. But it was kind of fun in a sick way if you really like that kind of challenge. So, and more people could do that than could make a fun game. So to add the fact that I have to make something entertaining in addition to just making it work, that was a really interesting challenge. And there was something about that that was tremendously compelling to me. And out of games, see, there's a funny thing that happens with games, is that how many of you feel that games programmers get a tremendous amount of respect in the software industry? See, I don't see a lot of hands going up. And I'm not surprised, because I used to notice this. And this was very interesting to me, because I did a lot of work outside of games in the software industry. A lot of work. And a lot of people look down at games because people really believe making games is goofing around. They think it's fun in games to make games. But it's not a lot of fun, necessarily, making games. Making games is brutal. You know, the people who are really doing it, it's just hard, grueling work. And also, it covers a much wider range of technical skills and abilities than most programming talents do. When I would interview people from other disciplines, it was amazing to me how narrow these programmers were, how they could do one sort of thing and not a lot. Games demand so many different disciplines from you. So it's always been my experience, having been both in and out of games, that games programmers typically are among the broadest and deepest programming talent in the software industry. And yet, they get some of the least respect in the industry. What's up with that? So, I got into games because I wanted respect. So, I became a therapist not to get respect, but this is what I like to do. I like to work with people. I really like that, and solving problems in a creative way, that's something that therapy is all about. It's a very creative, or it can be. Not all therapists are going to be that creative, but you can use a lot of creativity. There's a lot of technical basis for it also. So in some ways, to me, it's a very similar challenge to gaming. And it's the first thing that I have done in 25 or 30 years that was as gratifying for me as doing game programming at Atari, including doing game programming at other companies years down the road from Atari where it was a different thing. It just, you know, I hate to be honest, well, it's not like it used to be in the old days, you know. No, it's not, and that's a good thing, because it wouldn't work. I mean, it would be, we don't need to go back, but there was something really amazing about doing that work then and the experience of making a game then that was very cool. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you coming out to hear this. Yars is grateful and responsive. So thank you for coming. I wanted to know if you guys have any questions on Yars or on E.T. or any of the other stuff. Because we could also start talking about the E.T. thing.
Actually, can you talk about Saboteur a little bit?
What's that?
Saboteur. Is that not your game?
Having trouble hearing you.
Saboteur.
Oh, Saboteur.
Yeah.
Saboteur,
and why
okay.
You came back to it is so much later, like 2000-something, 2004.
Saboteur was my fourth game that I did that actually ultimately got released 20 years, or about 15 or 20 years after it was done, which was kind of interesting. It got released on the throwback system, but that's what, after E.T. and after all the fallout from that, you know, and I was done with that, I went back to doing what I love to do, which is making action games. There's an interesting thing about making action games versus making adventure games. And I think it's an interesting thing from a developer standpoint, and that is, when you make an action game, if you make a good action game, the developer can have exactly the same play experience as any player, right? Because it shouldn't have tricks and stuff you need to know about that nobody else knows about. A good action game, I can play it exactly the way another player is, and I can gauge how the game is doing by that play experience. When you do an adventure game, you can't do that, right? By definition, an adventure game, something that has puzzles, something that has secrets you have to uncover, the maker of that game can never have the experience of a player. So how do you gauge how the game is going? It's an interesting challenge. And I got tired of that by the end of E.T. and Raiders. So then I went back to doing just hardcore action. And Saboteur was just a number of gameplays that I've been kind of thinking over that I really wanted to exercise. And it was a lot of fun. And then it got delayed because it became the A-Team license, because we had a license. Can we do that? So we changed the graphics and made it the A-Team. No, we're not going to do the A-Team. Let's go back. And it went back and forth a couple of times, and then the company folded. So it just sat on a ROM for years until somebody eventually picked it up and published it. And that was interesting. So that's the Saboteur story.
Can you tell more on how you are drawing the noise in the neutral zone in Yars?
I'm sorry, I'm really having trouble understanding that.
Can you tell more how you are drawing the noise inside the neutral zone in Yars?
The neutral zone, your code, was scrolling code.
Oh, the code that's in the ion zone? You want me to talk about that a little?
Yeah.
Well, that was the code. That's what I said. When you take, you pick up stuff that's, you're marching code through the processor, right? And if you really want to be extravagant, you can go and make another graph for specific graphics and pull them in, but that's a lot of stuff to do. So instead, what I did was I just threw what was in the program register into the playfield register and just used that for graphics. And ran it up and down, and I put it in 2 ways counter-scrolling. Now, what was interesting was that became a legal question. When the people in legal found out about that, they had an issue because what they were saying is, oh my God. So somebody could tape the game and freeze frame it and go through and analyze it, and they might be able to see the code in the game. This is where people's heads were at back then, right? And they might see and then we're giving away the code to the game, and now we're not going to have copyright issues, and it's like, seriously? So I threw a mask on it. I did an Eeyore thing with it, and like I said, when it was counter-scrolling, and after I would throw the graphics in the playfield register, then I would put it in the color register. So that's why it got that glitter thing. So it was another one of those things that it was the cheapest possible thing I could think of to do in the fewest cycles, and I just did it, and it looked good. So I said, okay, I'm done. That's what happened with that thing. Because I just wanted something there. I just thought something needs to be in this thing because it's too black. There's too much black there. So,
Thank you.
no, you're welcome.
So Yars is a game that I can just get lost in for hours and hours, and I think in some ways goes against the notions of progression, and that you even said that you could just keep playing it. So that seems to me to be so different than what was going on at the time, and maybe even today. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that notion of potential continuous play. We often think that there has to be progression in a very specific way and risk in a very specific way. But I feel like I'm allowed to get into the zone with Yars and just stay there. So I thought maybe if you had some thoughts about the philosophy of that, or the things that you think about now with games with that, or a little opining on that.
That's a nice question, because that was something I very affirmatively thought about and thought through. Because what I don't like is games that tell you how to play them. Okay, I don't like a game that says you must play me this way. I like the idea of giving you as much capacity and possibility and letting you find the game within the game and play it how you want to. So a good game lets you play it, right? What I think is a relatively poor game forces you to play it the way it wants to be played. And what was interesting was there was a Yars Revenge sequel that was done for PS3. I think. There was actually, they got the name, they bought the title, and they did a Yars Revenge, and they made it a rail game. So they made it a 3D thing, and they had all these other things coming in and flying at you and stuff, and they pretty much threw away the story for the most part. And but what they did was they made it a rail game. So you have to go through it in a certain way, and I thought, that really pissed me off. There was something about it that really bugged me, because to me, that violated one of the fundamental precepts for me, and I think it's exactly what you're talking about Yars Revenge. Is like, do you get to have your own gaming experience, or do you have to do what they want to do? And they asked me about it. I mean, they didn't ask me to consult on the making of the game, which, that's fine. But it was interesting that when people asked me to comment about it later, and that's what I would say, I'm really kind of bugged that they turned it into a rail game. In a 3D world, that's a great thing to have a Yars experience in a 3D world. You could go anywhere, and you could do anything. You could have multiple monsters here and there, and you choose what battles you get into and what you engage. That, to me, would be more a Yars style, because it's about giving the player the opportunity to take the game the way they want it. It's like that whole idea of not having a frame. I want to take away the things that make you say, this is a game and this is how it needs to be, and open up options for the player. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Good question.
Hi, so I have a question about Raiders, and it had a really interesting concept with using an inventory system that was controlled by the second joystick, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the process that you came up with that design concept.
Yeah, I mean, the main issue with that was I didn't have enough controllers. So, I mean, I had to do something, and the idea of making it, I thought of trying to do a 2-player version of this game, and I couldn't see a way to make that work. It didn't make sense to me. So I thought, as long as it's a dedicated 1-player game, I'm just a believer, use everything you can. Try and use everything you can. Now, it's not intuitive. You know, Raiders and E.T. both have issues in the fact that they're not super intuitive. You need to know a few things to start playing them. And that's a difficult choice because it violates the easy-to-learn, tough-to-master rule, which is a great rule for games. But I just thought it was worthwhile getting the other controller involved because I couldn't think of how to make the game involved enough without having more of an inventory. Like Adventure just lets you carry one object at a time. And that's a great paradigm for the game, and it's simple, but it limits what you can do in the game very severely. And I wanted to make a bigger game space, so I decided to go with that. So then I tried to do some things that actually made how you manipulate the controllers part of the gameplay. Like to really play Raiders well, you need to know how to, when to drop and pick things up to sequence them in your inventory so you can drop some things and then have access to something else right away. So that actually became part of the play. And so I tried to integrate it that way. So once I decided to make it work that way, I tried to really rely on it and use it. One choice that I did make that was weird was I believe your primary controller, which is usually the player one controller, is the inventory controller. So when you pick up the game, you can't move, and you think there's something wrong with the game. I did that to clue people in that you need to look at the other controller, but if you never hear about that, you just think the game's broken. Raiders had some problems in that, you had to teach people how to use it. Once people started to get the idea and word started to spread, and also, this is pre-internet, if you can believe that. So you couldn't just post things, you couldn't put cheats out. People couldn't find out magically how to play the game. You had to put out information, and people had to actually look at it. RTFM. How many of you know RTFM? Right? Read the fucking manual already. So it's, and that's the thing. Who wants to do that? I don't want to do that in a game. So I actually made games that violated some of my own principles, but that's where that came from. I didn't feel I could do a game of the scope. Because when I set out to do Raiders, Adventure was a great game. Adventure was a genre-defining game. Like I said, Warren Robinette is speaking here, I think, later today maybe. And he's an amazing dude. I mean, he really came up with something that changed a whole lobe of gaming that was going on. So I felt if I'm going to do an adventure game, I want to make a contribution. I want to do something that's worth doing. So I felt to do something of that scope, I wanted to make the biggest and most involved adventure game on the VCS. And there's some debate. Some people say, well, Pitfall is the biggest adventure game because it has the most screens. But I really believe that the screens in Raiders are much more differentiated, and the play is varied more. So I feel I created a big world. And it really shifted from place to place, and it grew, and you had to learn about it. And that's what I was trying to do. Whether it succeeded or not is up to players. But that's what I was going for, and I needed the two controllers to make that work, to make it work at a level that I felt it would be okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any design precedent for something that you drew specifically on.
Defining a precedent?
Yeah.
Well, it established the precedent. Now other people could use, but I don't think anybody else ever used both controllers in a game, which is weird. There was some talk of trying to recreate some coin-op games by having a little board that would hold the two controllers so you could use the sticks like in a Robotron kind of a setup, but that didn't really go anywhere.
Thank you.
Well, first, I think you actually did succeed with the Raiders thing.
I appreciate it.
Before my question, just thank you for making 3 of the games that were just the most precious of my childhood. Maybe I'm one of the 10 people who actually loved E.T. as a kid, the game, and still love it today. Despite the manual, I figured out how to play. It was like a big puzzle. And but that leads me to the question is, so when you made those 2 adventure games, Raiders and E.T., and you were designing they're more puzzle games than adventure games, and you were designing those puzzles, what were you thinking? And in particular, the 2 games, you don't know if you won until the game is over, and you don't get your score, and it's hard to interpret even with what was written in the manual. So what was your thought process behind designing those kinds of puzzles and that kind of way of ending the game, and not knowing what's going on until it's all over? And what lessons might have you learned, or you might do better or keep the same today?
Well, that's a really good question. Okay, so that's 2 questions. So one is, Raiders to me is like a pure adventure game. E.T. is kind of a hybrid. It's kind of a weird thing. But I was just trying to do something like really fresh and new, and I was trying to do it desperately in a ridiculously short period of time. So It was a very limited thing. But with Raiders, it was just a pure adventure. To me, an adventure game is just about completing the adventure. That's what an adventure game's about, to me. And so if the biggest mistake I think I made with Raiders was not giving you more feedback along the way as to how you're doing. Not giving you something to say, bing, you just did something that was a good thing to do on the journey. Some sort of positive feedback mechanism to keep you rolling. And that, I say, was probably the biggest error in Raiders that I regret. And I would really go back and shift that in some way, have some way of cueing the player in that you're doing the right thing, you're on the right path. E.T. was a whole different story. Like, Raiders was 10 months, and E.T. was like 5 weeks. Okay? So with E.T., the challenge, most games took at least 5 or 6 months. Okay? So when you have 5 weeks to do a game, you don't try to do a 5 or 6 week game, a 5 or 6 month game in 5 weeks. That's a failure recipe, right? Not that this was such a successful recipe, but at least I wasn't going to design to fail. So I thought I'm going to design a game that I can do in 5 weeks, and that's the key to E.T. So what I did was I introduced a puzzle mechanic and a randomization thing. The reason there's all those pits is to give you a bunch of slots, a bunch of boxes to stick 3 things in so that every time I regenerate the game, it becomes a fresh puzzle and a fresh challenge to do. I felt that was a simple thing to do that would give the game legs, and I could do it quickly. My biggest mistake in E.T., the biggest mistake I made was I violated what I consider to be a fundamental rule of video gaming. And that is, it is okay to frustrate a player, but it is not okay to disorient a player. And in E.T., when you keep falling in the wells and you keep doing this and you keep winding up in these places, things would happen where you jump screens and you wind up in a pit, you don't know what's happening, you really don't know what's going on. I didn't know what was going on. I think it was really irritating, and I realized, wow, that's disorienting. Frustration is an integral part of video games. Frustration is like I see my goal and I can't quite reach it, but I understand how I'm falling short. That's a fundamental mechanic in games. That's a very important component of a game, right? You have to have, if there's no frustration, that means the goal was easy to achieve and there's no gratification in achieving it. So you need to have frustration, but disorientation is where that went. So my feeling is if I would have had just another few days, I could have made the tweaks to fix it so you don't keep falling back into holes, and close some of those things. But, the funny thing is, if I would have done that, nobody would probably be talking about E.T. anymore. It would have been just another mediocre game, and nobody would have had to bury it, and it would have been a whole nother story. But Yars and E.T. are very interesting things. They're like, I always like to say that, a lot of people talk about E.T. as the worst game of all time. And so I think it's the best 5-week development that was ever done.
I still think it's an amazing game. I had so much fun figuring it out. Like, it was a big puzzle to me,
Well, thank you. And a number of people feel that when they get to the play of the game and you get past the pit mechanics and you can play it, that it's not a bad game, and that's fine. But I will never argue with someone and tell them it's not a bad game. And in point of fact, when people say it's the worst game, I prefer people identify it. I don't believe it's the worst game of all time. I think there are worse games. But I prefer it being identified as the worst game of all time because Yars is frequently cited as one of the best games of all time. So between the two of them, I have the greatest range of any designer in history, right? Or another way to put it is, Yars Revenge is in the New York Museum of Modern Art, and E.T. is the subflooring of the New Mexico desert. So I like range and breadth. So I think those were the biggest mistakes on each of the games that I made. Was violating some fundamental principles of feedback and violating a principle of disorienting when I don't think that's okay. Is that?
Yeah, and actually, for Raiders, that was the thing that eventually, after years, turned me off on it, was just, I got tired of never knowing if I had found the Ark until I died. And, eventually you get good enough that you could just play forever, so you wind up intentionally dying at some point and saying, well, what's my score? Did I find the Ark? There's no way to know. Even if you had it in front of you, whether or not the game registered that you found it, and then you see the well of souls at the end, you just suicide eventually.
Yeah, and it could have had a better setup.
Yeah.
So thank you for your question.
Well, thank you.
And so we're just about out of time here, because I have to shut it down in 30 seconds.
Okay.
Really quick question?
Yeah, you mentioned that there is a Yars concept that hasn't been made. And you mentioned you might want to do it at some point. If you were to do it, would it be on like a modern platform or a smartphone, or would you go back to 2600 dev and have a home?
I will never program the 2600 again. I just want to be clear about that. I did that enough. It would be on like a phone thing or mobile platform or something very, very new.
Excellent.
Good question.
Look forward to it.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you coming out.